Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Eric Davis, continuing the conversations about the cultures of consciousness. When I was a younger lad than I am today, there were a few books that really influenced me. Actually, a lot of them. But the one that today's guest book makes me think of, or some of the ones, are books by William Irwin Thompson and Morris Berman. And what both of these giants did was talk about the big sweep of things, the large-scale historical, cultural consciousness drift or mutation from the Paleolithic mythic zone through the modern world, and do so in a way that you walk away from the experience with a greater sense of both the poetry, the history, the archaeological fact, and the mystical dream of the human development, the human experience as a mutating, extremely peculiar animal on our particular globe. And these great names, and if you haven't checked out books by these fellows, particularly The Time Falling Bodies Take to Light by Thompson, and Coming to Our Senses by Morris Berman, as well as Wandering God, a later book. And hopefully we'll get him on the show sometime. These great names were invoked for me by reading Gyrus's new book, North, The Rise and Fall of the Polar Cosmos. And I must admit that I am friends with Gyrus and that I helped work on an earlier draft of this book that he's been working on for over 10 years. But the man is no slouch. He has been working, reading, thinking, and synthesizing diligently across the fields of archaic consciousness, environmentalism, earth mysteries, magic, 2012, McKenna, psychedelics, and he's done so in a couple of books, Archaeologies of Consciousness, and a really wonderful book called War and the Noble Savage, which looks at this question of were ancient peoples viciously violent, or was it a relatively pacific scene? There are big debates in archaeology and anthropology about these questions, and one of the many wonderful things about Gyrus's work is he's not an academic. He's very open to the poetics, the spiritual yearning that many of us feel and that drives us to be interested in archaic cultures and altered states of consciousness. And at the same time, he has a scholar's ability to go in, synthesize a great deal of material, and also, most importantly, pay attention to the kind of critical questions that scholars introduce into these debates. Because if you're interested in these things and you read non-scholarly material exclusively, there's a looseness, a wiggliness, a tendency of old stories to keep getting repeated and repeated that really no longer bear very much under sharp scrutiny. And so reading North, which I'll talk about in a second, you really get this beautiful opportunity to sit down and read one thick, chewy book that is full of really vital and vibrant information, runs down all sorts of little marvelous cul-de-sacs and caves and labyrinths along the way. I happen to like books like that. Sometimes they confuse people, but in some ways it's the only way to get at the large reverberating network dynamics that you need to deal with in order to talk about the large-scale history of the human species, which is what North does. And I'm going to try to put my my little attempt at an overview of it just to give people a handhold, and I'll talk about it from the point of view that, again, what drives many of us to be interested in indigenous cultures, archaic cultures, magic, the supernatural, the paranormal, psychedelics, counterculture, et cetera, is a fundamental sense of a kind of absence of some sort of liveliness and meaningfulness, cosmic meaningfulness in our modern context. And so what a lot of us do is we look back and we see that the older civilizations, the Mayans or the Egyptians, or the any number of ancient peoples that we look back to, ancient civilizations, and we think of their magical universe of these divine kings and these holistic models that organize all of reality. And what Gyrus shows is how many of those earlier civilizational models with the big cultures were organized around this idea of the North, of the polar center, of hierarchy, a point high in the sky, of noble spiritual significance, and rising above the lower levels associated with matter. And many of us feel kind of drawn into these marvelous ideas of ascent, of various hierarchies of power. But what he's saying, and this is the real key, the real turn in the book, is that even these old dreams of the polar cosmos, of the ascent to heaven, of the higher principle that then organizes and rules over the lower, the chaotic, the messy, is itself a sort of artificial construct that was developed to respond to a trauma that's even greater than the trauma of entering into modernity and losing the ancient world of enchantments and correspondences. And this trauma, the great trauma of the human race, is the movement into agriculture out of the vast majority of our life as hunter-gatherers. And so, big sweep, big ideas, and I really encourage people to read North. It's a gas, and we'll be talking with Gyrus in just a moment. But of course, we'll bring on our co-host here on Expanding Mind, Maja Daou. Hi, Maja.
Hi, Erik. I have some exciting news. I had a synchronicity related to the show this morning that I wanted to share. Is that okay?
Wonderful.
Well, so I've told you before, and actually we had a synchronicity related exactly to this book because we had a guest on the show that was talking about finding true north, and then afterwards I had messaged you and said, oh my God, I've had all these synchronicities about finding true north. And then you told me you had just talked to Gyrus about this book. So this morning, right before the show, I went and checked my Instagram, and my good friend Liberty Larson, she just discovered she found a secret treasure, like a hidden treasure chest, the old notebook of her grandfather who started the Magic Castle here in Los Angeles. So she put on Instagram a photoed picture of his hand-typed page in his notebook, and it's a poem that he wrote. And here's what it says. At the top it says, Hedrick Van Loon says, and then there's a semicolon, and it says, high up in the north, in the land called Svithjod, there stands a rock. It is 100 miles high and 100 miles wide. Once every 1,000 years, a little bird comes to this rock to sharpen its beak. When the rock has thus been worn away, then a single day of eternity will have gone by. And then in parentheses it says, from the story of mankind.
Well, that's wonderful.
So appropriate, right?
Yeah, that's perfect. Well, I think we should just go right into it then and welcome Gyrus to the show. Hey, Gyrus, thanks for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Hey, Erik.
Hey, good. We got you. I was a little worried there.
That's cool. How's it going?
Yeah, pretty good. Good poem. I like it. It sort of gets us right into. I think it was a better summation than I gave of your work. It's quite beautiful. But I wanted to start. I just actually was reading through your bio before the show, and I've just always called you Gyrus, and I never really thought. I thought maybe it was just sort of a weird British name that I'd never heard. There's occasional, and then I see that you have a much more conventional British name, Stephen Taylor, and I realized then, of course, that Gyrus is a name that you chose partly because of the experience you had that got you going on this crazy journey. So why don't you talk about the name and the experience?
Well, the name, I was obsessed with this vortex image and the kind of spiraling aspect of it. So Gyrus there's a big story behind it, but my favorite little thing about it is the letter G. The capital and the lowercase are both kind of spirals. So that was a big obsession at the time. So the experience that got me into that obsession was, I guess, basically a bad trip at Glastonbury Festival. I guess everyone has that kind of festival experience where it all goes wrong. And mine ended up with me kind of staring into the sky and seeing a huge vortex in the sky that was going to kind of suck me into oblivion, and I was going to die right there and then. Obviously, I didn't. Obviously, it was just a drug thing. But the more I look back on that experience, the more it was kind of like kind of humdrum, as drug experiences go. But that image made a great impression on me, and I think what I've done with that image over time, and what that image has done with me, is very, very interesting. So that was my introduction to this image that I came to of the sky as a vortex, as looking at the pole star in the north, and imagining the slow, ponderous turning of the sky. Imagine it speeding right up and becoming the sky itself becoming a vortex. That obviously this connects with very standard kind of cosmological ideas of the heavens, and the pole star became this kind of idea of a portal into the heavens, into the infinite or whatever. So that's where it all started.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, there were so many wonderful things buried in the book, and one thing that really opened my eyes that I read yesterday was this notion that, as you're telling the story of the development or the mutation of humankind out of their hunter-gatherer lifestyle, you talk about the point where our ancestors leave Africa and go to the north. They go up a little bit, they come back to Africa for a while, and then they go formidably into the northern climes. And you make the point, which is so beautiful, that of course if you're growing up in Africa as a culture, as a people, and you look at the skies above, the stars are tracing, they're just moving from east to west. There's no polar point. There's no point that never moves. In fact, that's actually on it almost is identified with the Earth itself. So all you're used to is things moving above you, like the inside of a barrel. But then you go north and see, you're paying attention to the stars, and suddenly there's a point that doesn't move, and then you recognize that the stars are spinning around this sort of point that doesn't move, and of course, that's going to have, if you're paying attention to the sky, that's going to have an extraordinary, powerful symbolic point. And for you, that's really the beginning of this huge development of ideas and concepts and myths around this sort of northern point that doesn't shift, and it ends up carrying a lot of symbolic weight as human beings move from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle into civilization with hierarchy, social control, religion, exactly, as we understand it. I mean, just a marvelous, marvelous idea. But I really want to hear from you about how you approach this sort of thinking about hunter-gatherers, thinking about people that are so different than us in some ways, and yet in some ways we are still them in some way, and how you approach that intellectually, emotionally. I mean, there's so much of that animates this book.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, because how I got into all the ideas about prehistory and prehistoric art and consciousness, was kind of roaming around the English countryside, checking out stone circles, and there's a bunch of kind of petroglyphs, rock art over here as well. And that absolutely fascinated me. And I kind of, at the same time as researching it, I would kind of like immerse myself practically in these landscapes. I would, go around camping. I would have amazing dreams and interesting experiences wandering around. And these would feed into the research. And I thought that was always the fascinating part of it. I always trod this kind of line between what you would call scholarship and what might be called kind of questing, or that kind of like just experiential immersion in the landscape. So I was always interested in that crossover. Now, when it came to the point where I realized that just looking at ancient culture or prehistoric culture was obviously it's a wild generalization, and within that there's huge amounts of distinctions to be made. One of the first you should make, and I think it was one of the last that I made, was between hunter-gatherer culture, nomadic foraging cultures, and sedentary agricultural societies. Now, as soon as that happened, it's kind of like, okay, where do I go with this experiential part of my research? The obvious kind of route would be to, whether you kind of like sign up to an anthropology course or just go off traveling, you would kind of go and make contact with kind of people still living in this way. I never ended up doing that for a lot of different reasons. And over time, I've kind of reflected on this and thought, well, am I betraying my kind of initial commitment to experience and feeding that into my research? But and there's a certain amount to that. I accept that, but at the same time, I always kind of recognized there was something else going on, which is that I'm actually most interested in prehistoric, what was going on prehistorically, the cultures, societies that still live in a similar way today, contemporary hunter-gatherers. They're, obviously, they're incredibly beleaguered. They've been devastated by Western imperialism and are still being, daily decimated. In terms of our kind of, revisioning our kind of view of our prehistory, obviously they've been immensely useful for, if used carefully. We don't kind of like just assume that hunter-gatherers we bump into now are going to be living exactly the same as people did 20,000, 200,000 years ago. Their kind of cultures are essential for starting to imagine prehistory that far back. So right away, there's a sense that the experience is kind of not such a part of that. And I think the writing this book has been part of what's been difficult for me about it is that it's been a much more intellectual thing than I've been used to recently. In the past with other research. And I think there's downsides to that, but I think one of the upsides is that kind of lack of experience of specific living hunter-gatherers kind of lets you take a wider perspective that you need if you're going to do this foolish thing that I've done, which is trying to write a history of everything. And I read some, I'm incredibly interested in, grateful for the anthropologists and ethnographers who have given me all the stuff that I've worked with. But some anthropologists, I kind of read them and they seem to be kind of biased in some ways and seem to, while they've brought back sort of amazing kind of information about how these people live, sometimes there's a kind of tendency to be clouded by the specific experience of the specific culture you've been working with, and then missing out the variations with other kind of like people living in a similar way but slightly differently. So that's my. Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say that. I mean, one of the things that I really love about your work, even though it's so ambitious that of course it's going to be not everything you imagine it to be or want it to be, but I think it's incredibly successful and powerful is that you're able to, particularly these days, there's a lot of skepticism about big ideas inside academia. So the idea, as you point out, of writing a history of everything, of the big picture of human transformation, that's really poo-pooed. It's seen as dangerous, as inevitably going to be a fail. It's not worth the effort. It puts out the wrong idea, and so you have this tremendous pressure on much smaller bits that are then analyzed to death and problematized, is that famous academic word, where every kind of generalization has to be seen as being dangerous or worthy of suspicion, worthy of throwing complexity on it. And that's all, in some ways, for the good to a degree, because it's very easy, especially with these topics, to do something like Mircea Eliade did, who was a brilliant man, who loved the imagination, and we owe a lot to him. But he also made some fundamental errors in terms of not just the particulars of his idea, how he was interpreting a particular ethnographer or whatever, although he made mistakes in that zone too, but more in trying to demand that are these singular, almost archetypal forces that you find everywhere, and going too far with that and doing it in a way that ends up crushing difference and in some ways instituting the kind of mistake that you're describing in your book, which is this over-reliance on verticality, on the notion of the higher heavens versus the distributed, dispersed, more horizontal existence of earlier peoples. But in critiquing that stuff, a lot of scholars go too far, and then they're no longer able to imagine on a larger scale in a way that I think enables all of us to sort of put ourselves into the picture. And you combine those things where you take away a lot of the myths that I think a lot of people have who are sort of generally interested in these things, but they haven't looked that closely at it. And you're like, look, we can't say that. We don't know that. This is tricky. This is a problem. So you're very careful about that stuff, but at the same time, because of your experience, because of your willingness to come from your experience, which the vast majority of academics are professionally obliged not to do, as well as perhaps temperamentally, you're able to give us back something of that bigger picture at a time when we need those. We need that.
Definitely. It's. I think you will probably know David Graeber's work. He's an anthropologist who's written a few years ago. He wrote a book on debt. I think it's called Debt: The First 5,000 Years. And he quite consciously takes on that issue that, he's kind of like, as anthropologists are kind of like the best placed people in the world to kind of offer some kind of like radical revision of the whole of history. But generally, as a discipline, there's a lot of timidity about doing that for very good reasons, as you say. So I think what I was trying to do was think about what we can take on board as kind of just having a general kind of like idea of the whole of human history, which I kind of think that most people do, even if it's unconscious, And I think that was my. That was my kind of feeling, was that much as it's incredibly important to have historical studies that really go into the detail and the texture of specific times and people and places, that kind of historical research it's possible that it's kind of drifting out into the world on a kind of background of quite kind of unexamined, exactly the kind of simplistic kind of Eurocentric narratives that we're trying to move away from, but just kind of ignoring them. Maybe that's not the right thing to do. I was just kind of wondering what could I do to a kind of simplistic arc to the whole of human history that you would be able to kind of like remember it and bear it in mind and and apply it to different situations, but that it kind of challenges some of the pernicious things about Eurocentric narratives. So for me, that's the main thing, is to kind of take what is often this kind of habitual distinction, this dualism that I think Eliade definitely suffered from, which is just to kind of say, well, there's the modern world and there's the ancient world. And in the ancient world, okay, there's kind of, paganism and hunter-gatherers, but they're all kind of like so different from us moderns who are kind of, whether it's to do with kind of secularism or materialism or science or whatever, kind of cuts us off from that world of, being tied up with nature and believing in spirits and gods. I think that's an important distinction. And for me, that's the Copernican revolution is the kind of cosmological pivot where, that all kind of starts to shift into the kind of like Euro-dominated kind of modern world. But for me, the agricultural revolution is just as important a cosmological shift that where there's this division between what we would call, within what we would call the ancient world, between sedentary agricultural societies, maybe pagan, and there's a lot of variety there, but there's a huge difference to what's going on with hunter-gatherers. Their cosmological sense of how the world fits together, their relationship to nature, their relationship to spirits, and their relationship to all these things that we have a tendency just to kind of lump together as kind of pre-modern.
So let me ask you this. If in your research, did you discover that it tended to be these northern kind of races or people? I mean, possibly you could say it's because they can't grow anything up right in those places like they can't be agricultural because no plants are going to grow. So did you feel like it was just like all the races of people up in northern areas, or was there like a particular group that was more so these teachings, or do literally like once you get over a certain point on the planet Earth, like everything kind of shifts in that direction?
I don't think quite to that extent. That's kind of a complex issue in terms of the actual kind of latitudes of different cultures. I think a lot of the things I'm talking about, we're looking at kind of, the latitudes of, say, the Middle East or
right.
China. And they're where these are where the big civilizations came up, where the real kind of like ideas of centralization, hierarchical power became really entrenched, and they became kind of hooked up with their cosmological models, which were tied into a vision of the world being pivoted on the northern celestial pole, because that was in view enough for them to see and think, okay, that's the form of the world, and this is how our society reflects the form of the world. Once you get kind of further north, where you're talking about where it's difficult to grow things, I mean, these are hunter-gatherer cultures to a large extent, and I mean, I go into Eskimo Inuit cultures in my book a lot, and that's kind of interesting. They're kind of really far north to the extent where the pole star is almost above them,
right.
and they're living in incredibly harsh situations. But actually, they're some of the most egalitarian cultures you'll find in a lot of cases. And they've remained of necessity hunter-gatherer because you can only live off animals that you hunt. You can't really live off plants. So I think that kind of brings in an interesting point, which is obviously there's no necessity imposed on your kind of cultural beliefs, your beliefs about the way society should be by how the cosmos appears. These people are at much higher latitudes where they've got a much kind of like stronger sense of the world being polar, having a kind of like center that everything revolves around, that's up there on high. But they're still egalitarian. Now, further kind of south towards like the Middle East or China, where even Egypt, where big civilizations came to be, they kind of hooked up their social hierarchies, their monarchies, kingship. They hooked them up to this image of the cosmos, and it's to a huge extent it's a projection from human societies onto the cosmos. We've kind of like taken some appearances of the cosmos that are there, but then we've kind of layered all our kind of like social, political baggage onto them, and to a large extent use those projections in turn to try to naturalize social powers. So, these cultures where the king is the all-important kind of like fulcrum of society, there's a kind of sense that, well, we're just following nature. Look at there's a star, everything goes around it, and that's like our king, we're just following nature, when it's actually the other way around. We've projected our society onto the cosmos.
Mm.
Yeah, that's the really key link, and I want to flesh that out a little bit more. But first, we got to take a break here. You're listening to Expanding Mind with Erik Davis and Maja Daou. We're talking with Gyrus about his great new book, North: The Rise and Fall of the Polar Cosmos.
Welcome back to Expanding Mind on the Progressive Radio Network. This is Maja Daou here with Erik Davis. We are speaking with Gyrus about the North. And to expand a little bit about that king idea and us people kind of projecting, one of my favorite mythologies about the idea of the North is seen littered throughout everything, that idea that there's this, like, abyss to the north, and then after the abyss is, like, where heaven is, or the Golden City, or, New Jerusalem, or whatever. And there's all these ideas in multiple cultures that to be like a king or noble or majestic or even godlike in the Greek and Roman cultures, you wanted to head or align your compass with the north direction. In Egypt, too, right, they talk about it, so that there's this idea where somehow affiliated with the north, there's this abyss to cross, and then you get to be like a king, or, you can earn that sort of crown, the starry crown or whatever. So did you come across any kind of like source for those, or nail it down to something? Because then talking about how that is like a story that people seem to be projecting specifically into a region. So it's always fascinated me, like what is that kind of from? I don't know if you were able to see any kind of origins, or was it just in a lot of places?
Yeah, it's in a lot of places, yeah. So, enough that it would be really hard to pin down to any kind of origin. I don't know, my general sense is, I think a lot of this is down to what is kind of like a primal creation motif, the separation of heaven and earth. And, we have it in the Bible where kind of right at the beginning of Genesis, the waters are divided, and I think there's the upper waters and the lower waters. We have it in Babylonian myth where I think Marduk, the culture hero, he kind of gets Tiamat, the chaos goddess of the ocean, and pretty brutally tears her apart and splits her body apart, and the upper half forms the heavens, and the lower forms the earth. And there's a sense that this is the kind of cosmology that Eliade was really interested in. It was kind of like so many cultures you get this split between heaven and earth, and inherent to this, there's a sense of a split between us humans and the gods, kind of like lower kind of material realm and the transcendent realm of the spirit. And Eliade, rightly within the bounds of his kind of remit, argued that there's a need to kind of maintain a connection to this. So he had an image of the axis mundi, the axis of the world, which was a kind of bridge, as you say, across this abyss, which between us and the transcendent. Now, that's taken by Eliade as kind of fundamental, that all cultures have this kind of split between above and below, and we need a kind of like bridge across it to keep us hooked up to the spirit.
Right.
But what my research taught me was that I don't think this split is essential at all. I think it's a memory, probably a kind of like a coded unconscious memory of the agricultural revolution and the all the transformations around that led from generally egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies to more hierarchical sedentary agricultural societies. And these days I kind of see that mythical motif, the split between heaven and earth, is kind of a memory of the origins of class divisions, and there's an obvious impetus to associate the elite, the king or whoever, with the heavens, and it's a kind of very ambivalent thing.
And that's so fascinating and true too, because then those concepts of heaven and hell are used for what? But to control all the people under the king with like some threat of fear, right?
Yeah. And it kind of bolsters your position as someone in power if you've set yourself up as the conduit to the transcendent world that everyone needs a kind of connection to. So,
yeah, that seems to me the really, really key moment to emphasize, because I remember also specifically when I saw that difference, the difference. I mean, I knew the general difference between hunter-gatherers and earlier civilizations and the problems with agriculture and the problems with as soon as you have agriculture, you have surplus, and then you can start having social hierarchy, and then the social hierarchies need to justify their continued existence as they become more oppressive, and you develop these larger social machines that organize labor of all of these people and keep the elite in power, and so you create religious structures that have hierarchy and naturalize these things. So that I got, but what I hadn't gotten is that fundamental thing about verticality, about ascent, and about how all my ideas about what spirituality was about, what meditation was about, what visionary experience was all about ascent. And the point where I saw that difference, and it's an influence you mentioned in the book, is in Morris Berman's work, and particularly in Wandering God. And he talks about that the consciousness of verticality is very appropriate for a hierarchical society where literally there's people who are on top and they're higher up and they're on top of the pyramid, and the pyramid goes up and it points to the heavens, and the heavens is where the gods come from, et cetera, et cetera. But if you really if you really imagine the situation of hunter-gatherers, they live in what Berman calls a horizontal world, where their relations are more networked and distributed around them in the place that holds them up, and their societies are generally, although they might have some social hierarchy, but generally they're quite egalitarian. And so it's it's like another rather than the division between higher and lower, there's the division between the vertical and the horizontal as a space of consciousness, a space of encounter, as a way of orienting yourself to the world that potentially has more interesting political effects as well.
Yeah. Sorry, am I going to say something?
It's ironic because exactly what you're saying is actually on the top of the pyramid. On the pyramidions that they found, they always have the same hieroglyphs inscribed, which says, "Look to the horizon." So it's funny because once you get to the tippy top of the tallest pyramid, the instruction on it is to look at the horizon.
Yeah. I mean, there's also a kind of contradiction in here for me in that kind of image of the sky as a vortex, but also as implying this kind of like axis. I've always just been fascinated throughout the research with this paradox that the image of the axis, whether it's in the Mayan world, there's a pyramid, and the king is identified with the axis of the world, and there's endless images of trees or vertical structures that image this kind of vertical cosmos. It's an image of stability. It's an image of order, hierarchy. And stability. Whereas at the same time, if you're kind of like, in the position I don't think I was looking at the North Star, but I was seeing the sky as this kind of vortex. It was this incredibly overwhelming experience of kind of being engulfed. And obviously I was going through some sort of kind of like ego death. It was just like absolute chaos, So that fascinates me that there's these two images in one, that you've got this kind of like stable axis, but at the same time it's kind of like the cosmos spinning around it, and the idea of a portal into the infinite creates this sense of kind of like a chaotic kind of dispersal or engulfment, and and that's kind of I don't think I've ever kind of there's no way I've kind of pinned that down to any kind of specific kind of culture and kind of analyzed how those two images work together. They're just more of a kind of like pair of images that have just hung there, kind of informing everything that I've done. And there's a lot of kind of paradox going on in terms of, say like in Mayan society, where you have the role of the shaman and the king combined. The shaman, obviously the role to a large extent is to let go of the kind of everyday self and to plunge into realms that are, by everyday standards, incredibly disorderly and kind of chaotic, and find new kind of images of order and use those to kind of keep society bound together. And there's just this really, really interesting paradox going on there, where much as there is this clear horizontal vertical distinction, and you can kind of like see these kind of agricultural societies as being hierarchical power, kind of modeled on power and hierarchy, actually at the same time there's this effort by those structures of power to bind society together and to create an order within which people can function. So I kind of, for the purposes of the story, sometimes I kind of simplify that kind of model of the cosmos, but at the same time, I'm kind of really aware that there's this kind of like contradictory nature to all those structures of power. Because they've embedded themselves so deeply into the cosmos and into people's sense of what is orderly and what kind of how things are supposed to work, that they've made themselves essential in those societies. They've made themselves essential to life itself. So and politically, that's kind of interesting too, because it's part of their power is their coming across as essential to order and life being lived well.
Well, one of the things I want to point to now is bringing it more towards our own time. Is you make a very good case for why it's important to look at mythologies of the North, of the poles, of the Arctic, of the Antarctic, in modern times, to see traces, relics, sort of ruins of this larger story you tell about the rise and fall of the polar cosmos. The basic idea, once you have the Copernican revolution, we have a new model of the universe. It displaces this idea of a central polar axis that's keeping the Earth system in place, and instead we're thrust out into this universe that keeps expanding and expanding. And once you hit the 20th century, it just balloons beyond imagination. But there's relics of this story, and one of the most fascinating chapters you have is called Ice. And it's about the way that the North has played a role in the modern imagination, in occultism, with ideas of the hollow earth and Nazis with their flying saucers beneath the earth, and as well as horror fiction, science fiction, and other sort of realms of the imagination that are trying to rediscover that enchantment that's lost in the official modern world. So, talk a little bit about your researches in the realm of ice.
Okay, well, I mean, this is, past the Copernican revolution, it all gets very kind of complicated and interesting. The way I tried to kind of keep a handle on it was I had this image of the world tree being this kind of like tree on the axis of the world, and the Copernican revolution, that process in kind of unseating us from this position in the center of the cosmos, was a kind of felling of the world tree, and the tree kind of like fell to earth, and remnants of it were left at the poles, at the Arctic and the Antarctic. So at the same time as that old polar cosmos being destroyed and superseded by a kind of modern, in a lot of ways, in some ways decentered cosmos, there were kind of traces of this. And I think in terms of the poles themselves, the horror fiction stuff was incredibly interesting. I think the cycle of narratives around buried polar aliens, which kind of starts with Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness, and then there's John Campbell's short story Who Goes There, which was most famously filmed as John Carpenter's The Thing, and especially that film and the Thing narratives I just found a huge amount that tallied and mirrored and hooked up with the narrative that I'd already constructed through prehistory. And in The Thing, I really started to see The Thing as this remnant of the decentered, animistic kind of energies that were the characteristic of the hunter-gatherer cosmos. I think it's an incredible kind of like extreme encapsulation of that idea of kind of completely decentered energy. This kind of thing kind of imitates whatever it comes across, and it's got no single controlling function. And I think that I've just recently read there's a great short story written about 4 years ago by, I can't remember the guy's name, but the short story is called The Things, and it's a ingenious little take on John Carpenter's film. It tells exactly the same narrative, but from the perspective of the thing itself. And in doing that, he's kind of like playing with kind of the idea of kind of a singular internal narrator, because there's no such thing in the thing. You know, it's distributed between different organisms that it's imitated. And I think that's a really great thing to refer to because that really kind of like conveys the decentered kind of nature of this creature. But at the same time, there's this is obviously not just a happy return of our kind of like golden age when we were all living in happy egalitarian unity with nature. This is a horror film, and it's kind of and I think that's significant because I think my kind of way of imagining what's going on there was to see the thing as this energy, this animated, decentered energy that was distributed around in kind of hunter-gatherer culture, was kind of corralled and kind of structured and forced into certain structures by the structures of civilization, and then kind of projected into the heavens. And this is God. This is the idea of like God being the supreme kind of arbiter of motive power and kind of order in the universe, being up there beyond the sky in the heavens. This is a kind of like leeching of all the kind of like Earth's animate energy and all the kind of like complex psychological relationships we used to have with nature. This is like leeching all that energy and just kind of like hoarding it in the sky in a kind of I imagined it as like a repository of energy that elites would kind of draw on and utilize and manipulate in order to maintain their control. And then at the beginning of the thing, we have the shot of the infinite blackness of space, and there's a flying saucer comes into view, and it's kind of broken and it's like wobbling, and it crashes to Earth. And for me, this is that kind of projected energy, God, or the gods in the heavens, after the scientific revolution, falling back to Earth, and it crashes in at the axis of the world in the south this time, in the Antarctic. But and it's it's kind of this distributed energy has been kind of brutalized and distorted by those thousands of years that it's been kind of forced into into structures that mirror our hierarchies,
And one of the things I get from your work, as well as just the way that you work, the way that you have worked in terms of taking your own experiences in nature around sacred sites, traveling, dreams, visionary experiences, taking that very seriously as a sort of space of probing, of questioning, of asking these questions and attempting or opening up a space to connect with these energies, earth energies deeply rooted in human experience, but at the same time, doing the hard work of research and thinking very long and hard on these topics, that there are ways of sort of making a slightly less traumatic encounter with the these sort of ambient energies. That in a way, that's part of the story, is that however much we try to push them aside, they're going to be there in some way or another, in psychosis, in horror films, in evil, in all of these places we sort of don't really know what to do with exactly. Do you see now a sort of return to, or a reawakening of some of these earlier modes, the pre-polar cosmos, the horizontal hunter-gatherer networked relationships with the ambient energies of the Earth itself that aren't so organized into these mythic hierarchies?
Definitely, yeah. And I think the more and more I use it as a kind of way of thinking about, contemporary occultism, or, whether it's kind of like neo-paganism, Wicca, or Earth mysteries, or whatever. More and more I kind of look at them and see the most interesting aspects of them that are there. Seem to be kind of drawing on, consciously or not, the kind of the hunter-gatherer world more than the kind of classic kind of pagan world. But obviously there's kind of for me really kind of like interesting and difficult kind of complexities going on, because we've to a large extent politically we've kind of brought in a kind of more decentered kind of mode of life, driven by capitalism, by this is kind of like our this is our decenteredness, the kind of distributed nature of the market, and especially now in the kind of digital world. But unlike the hunter-gatherer world, where I think there was a kind of very close marriage between political, social relationships, which are egalitarian, and kind of spiritual or eco-psychological relationships. They were both very kind of decentered and based on like constant negotiation. I think our modern decenteredness, the distributed nature of the market, is kind of almost like it's become like a new cloak that structures of hierarchy have taken on, and we see this starkly now. The increasing inequality. We can't just kind of take the Copernican revolution as well. That's the end of the polar cosmos. I think the structures of hierarchical power that were accumulated over those thousands of years since the world of the hunter-gatherer, they're clinging on, and they've kind of used and made use of the new kind of decentered structures going on for their own purposes. So I think, in terms of society and politics, that's something to really keep an eye on if you're kind of looking at things through the model of this book. But at the same time, yeah, I mean, obviously there's a huge, I think, to a large extent, healthy kind of revival of these non-hierarchical ways of interacting with nature and the realms of the spirit.
Well, wonderful. I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. That's a fine place to end. Gyrus's new book again is North: The Rise and Fall of the Polar Cosmos, and he's got tons of extra essays and bits on the website polarcosmology.com.
That's right.
So Gyrus, thanks so much for joining us here on Expanding Mind.
It was great to be here.
Yeah, and congratulations on the book. I know it was a long time coming. It's got a great cover too.
Oh yeah, it's a good looker. Yeah. But thanks. Yeah, it's good to talk.
Okay, from me and Majid Ali out there, keep your minds open.